not just this particular passage, but the whole section in general. First off, okay. All right, just some general observations on the numbers, and matter of fact, going all the way back to Genesis. Genesis through Numbers, Deuteronomy, they are really the origins of the Jewish race, the people, and I think one of the things you can learn from this is a lot about ourselves. It teaches who God is, how people got here, how people act, what our human nature is, and so there's some things I'm going to mention today that are not necessarily right here in these chapters, but just, I think sometimes we're really hard on the Jewish people and the way they acted, and, I will get to that in just a minute, but the first thing I'm going to mention is very early in here it mentions, and Steve gave me part of the teacher's book, it mentions the Nephilim and the Anakim, which were very large races of people that 9, 10 feet tall, huge people. This groups are also, those words are used back in Genesis, just so there's no confusion, they're not the same people, because those people occurred before the flood, these were after the flood. If those were the same people, they all drowned. So they're just talking about the very huge people in the land. And when this part we're coming to came up, this was about somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years after they left Egypt. And last week we talked about they saw these giant people, and Steve mentioned possibly Goliath, and some of those people were their descendants. But you've got to think about how these people had felt. They left Egypt 1.5 years, 2 years before. They've been wandering around in a desert, and it's, 100 degrees, hotter than in here. It's plenty warm today. So they've been wandering around the desert in the summertime, because it had been 1.5 years, they had to be some unbelievable heat. Deserts are very cold at night, so they're freezing to death at night. These people are tired, they're worn out, and they don't have a very short fuse. They do have a very short fuse. So the other thing to think about here is, we've talked about there's probably somewhere between 1 million and 2 million people involved. That would put a camp, from what I was reading about, somewhere in the 30 to 40 miles across, just for all these people to sit down, set up tents, and then prepare meals, whatever they're doing. So you're talking about a huge amount of things. And so if you think about that, if they're moving in a given direction, so let's say they're moving east, and then the cloud rises from the temple, which I'm going to mention something about that in a minute, it occurred to me this week. But if the cloud rises from the temple and they've got to move, if they reverse directions, they now have to go 30 or 40 miles to get the people that are supposed to be in front, and the people that are supposed to be in the back. So every time they move, it's not just, let's jump in a car and run over and do it. So you think about this now. You've got older people there, you got babies, kids, children, animals, etc. If you think about they're moving multi-generations, you got babies and you got people, Moses lived to be 120, so people that are 90, 100 years old. All right, and we're going to all of a sudden pick up and walk from here, the Jewish race, at this particular time. Yes, you are, because either you're going to ride on some type of a pack animal, or you're packing up to follow the cloud 30 or 40 miles. So if they made 30, 40 miles in a day, they were doing really well. So, and not only that, you're trying to deal with babies and everybody at the same time. So these people have not had a real easy trip getting to where they are in the first place. And that being the case, they're not receptive to any more troubles. And these guys come back and say, okay, we've got giants in the land. Man, we got enough troubles just packing our stuff and moving across to the opposite side of the tank. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And then I'd say something about the fire and the cloud. If you read carefully, the Bible says that when they weren't moving, the fire and the cloud came down and covered the temple. So except for the priests who went in and out, people never really even saw the temple. And this fire must have been something like the burning bush was. So it must have come down, sat on top of the temple, and now the temple's on fire, but it's not consumed. So, and remember, God showed his power to Moses and his glory by doing that with just a bush. So when they talk about the glory of God sitting on the temple, he's actually covering it and engulfing the temple with his presence. So that was just something I hadn't thought about much. So, okay, it goes 11 through 16. Okay, well, let me talk about verse 10 real quick. And then I'll get somebody to read 11 through 16, because I'm off here about it. I did pull a couple of verses before and a couple of verses after that I'm going to comment on too. Okay, the background of where they are today, it says, in verse 10, I just pulled that one out. It says, but all the congregation bade stone them, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. Now, if you read back in Numbers 14, verse 1, this wasn't they just up and decided to stone them. They'd been up all night long doing nothing but complaining and getting together in groups and deciding how tough things were. And so this was almost like a conspiracy thing. And the result of it was they decided they're going to kill Moses and head back to Egypt, which I don't know how that really would have resolved anything, but that's what they had decided to do. And they also threatened to kill Joshua and Caleb along with them, because Joshua and Caleb were the ones that said we should go ahead and try to take the land. So if somebody will pick up and have at it 11 through 16 then.
The Lord said to Moses, how long will these people despise me? How long will they not trust in me, despite all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them with a great plague and destroy them. Then I will make you into a greater and mightier nation than they are. But Moses replied to the Lord, the Egyptians will hear about it, for by your strength you brought up these people from them. They will tell it to the inhabitants of the land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among these people. How you, Lord, are seen face to face, how your cloud stands over them, and how you go before them in a pillar of a cloud by day, and in a pillar of fire by night. If you kill these people with a single blow, the nations that have heard of your fame will declare, since the Lord wasn't able to bring these people into the land he swore to give them, he has slaughtered them in the wilderness.
Okay, as I was studying, and the Lord brought to mind about these verses to me, okay, just like the text says, when God says how long, it wasn't he didn't know how long. God knows everything. And God knew in this particular case, these people would never fully trust in him. As we're going to find out later that he decided how to resolve that matter after Moses' intervention. But he says, how long will the people provoke me? This is not just a matter of God was surprised and taken off guard, and he's asking why they're doing this. God is pointing out that these people have a special type of resistance to what he wants to do. It's really not just, I'm afraid and I don't want to go in, but they had a contempt for God that, God said we can go in here, but no, we can't. God doesn't know what he's talking about. It's more of a rebellious attitude of, I don't want to do it, and I don't believe what God said. He lied to us. And one of the things God doesn't tolerate is people questioning his character. And so when these people are basically saying, God's a liar, and God says, no, I'm not, I'll just wipe you out. And then Moses gets involved in it. And you got to remember now, God has already sent them multiple signs to show how he can do what he promises to do. Between the Red Sea and they've already had one of the instances of getting the water in the wilderness, and the manna's been coming every morning. So God has shown that he has the power, but they're still saying, God's a liar. He said we could do it, but we can't. And God just doesn't tolerate that. So God says that he's going to strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them, make another nation, and God's already used plagues. So now, a little earlier when we read about it, said God's presence showed up at the tabernacle. So he made his presence known in a way even greater than the fire that, or in this case in the daytime, the cloud that normally sat on the temple. He's made it clear, I'm here to talk to Moses, and all the people know he's there talking to Moses. And of course the Bible doesn't specifically say this, but I don't think God was keeping it quiet. I think God was letting the people know what he was planning on doing. So, and this should have generated a fear in them, and probably did, because they'd already seen what God can do with the plagues in Egypt. When God became displeased with Pharaoh, he sent multiple plagues and basically wiped that nation out. I mean, I think that I have read in some history books and whatnot that there's a time period that Egypt was, you know, the world power, and then certain people were killed, the king's son and whatnot, and they became not a world power. So when God intervened back in Exodus as they left, that wasn't just something that lasted a week and then everything was back to normal. The results of what happened that week were permanent. And because they lost armies in the Red Sea and the whole bit, though. So, not surprising, but it is something that history has documented elsewhere, that there was a time that they had risen to power and then events transpired that caused them not to be there. Additionally, they had seen what happened with the worshiping of the golden calf back in Exodus 32, and how he had wiped out a significant number of the people in that situation. So this isn't an idle threat that they're just saying, oh, well, you know, God's not really going to do that. God's already had to punish them in ways that killed many of the people. All right, so then it says that Moses intervenes and says, well, the Egyptians are going to hear about it, and this is very similar to what Christ does for us. Christ steps in as our mediator, and he speaks to God for us. And he's there to represent us before God when necessary. And that's exactly what Moses does here. He's just intervening for the people and saying, God, let's remember, you told everybody you're bringing these people out of Egypt. You're going to take them to the promised land. And he goes on to say, if you kill all these people, then all the nations are going to hear about it. Everybody's going to be talking about God couldn't do what he said he was going to do. And one of the things that I've noticed here, and this has been in my own life, God, or Moses, when he intervenes, it wasn't, hey, do it for me. You know, I like these people. It was, God, I want you to remember that the ultimate goal is your glory, which God knows that. But he wants us to bring our heart into the situation where that when we ask for a prayer, that it's not solely just to satisfy us. It's also to bring a miracle that we can use to glorify God on what he has done. And Moses didn't say, do it for me. He said, God, do it for you. And God does choose to do that as we go on to see here. We'll let somebody pick up at what, 17 through 19? Okay.
So now, may my Lord's power be magnified, just as you have spoken. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in faithful love, forgiving iniquity and rebellion. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people, in keeping with the greatness of your faithful love, just as you have forgiven them from Egypt until now.
Okay, so Moses goes on to continue to pray for the people, and at this point in his prayer, he begins to ask God to forgive the people based on God's nature. And again, when we pray, God wants us to recognize his nature and his character. That's one of the things that God is upset with the people about, is he promised them to take them into the promised land, and they said, you're lying to us, you can't do it, the people are too big. Moses, in his prayer, recognizes God's nature, and he asks God to be consistent with his nature of mercy. And, you know, by God's grace and mercy, saved, unsaved, or otherwise, none of us would be here if he just chose to forget to put oxygen on the earth tomorrow morning. I mean, the fact that God is merciful is the reason any of us have our next breath. And so Moses is well aware of God's merciful nature, and he asked God to forgive the people consistent with his nature. And God's love, and likewise ours, is not based only on feelings. As a matter of fact, my understanding of love is it's not a feeling at all. Because some days you feel like loving, some days you don't feel like loving. God's love, and the love that we should mimic, is based on loyalty and commitment. God made a commitment to bring Israel as a nation out of Egypt and to take them into the promised land. And so Moses is saying, go back to that love you had that said you would take them out, and let's bring them in. And so God does exactly that, because God has a perfect love. His love is committed, it's loyal. And when God makes a promise, likewise, he's going to always be true and honest, and he's going to follow through on what he said. So Moses is again appealing to God to prove who he is for God's glory. And I think that's kind of the gist of what 17 through 18 and 19 are all about, is who are you, God? You're talking about wiping out these people. God, that's not who you are. And as Moses brings that to God's attention through prayer, that's exactly what God says. Okay, I am who I said I am, just like he was at the burning bush. I am the great I am, and I don't change. And so God is going to agree to pardon them. And I guess we're now down to verse 20. Is that correct? Okay. And we'll let somebody read that one for us.
The Lord responded, I have pardoned them as you requested. Yet as I live and as the whole earth is filled with the Lord's glory, none of the men who have seen my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tested me these 10 times and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have despised me will see it. But since my servant Caleb has a wicked spirit and has remained loyal to me, I will bring him into the land where he has gone, and his descendants will inhabit it.
Okay. The thing that I noticed first about this group of verses is in verse 20, God says, I have a pardon according to thy word. Moses, the prayers you've made are 100% in agreement with who I am. And I'm going to do what only I can do, and I am going to pardon their sins. Only God can pardon anything. Now, all of us can forgive as we imitate God, and these people have sinned, and sin requires a pardon, not just forgiveness. And so God says, I am going to pardon them. And now, a pardon is not, there's never any consequences. A pardon is you're not going to suffer the full punishment of what you deserve. So, I mean, to get a pardon in a situation, say a person has injured or killed someone, the governor might be able to come in and pardon them, but that does not alleviate all of the other consequences that are going to result from that. So, God gives a pardon here, and then he comes back in 21 and he says, you're right, because I'm doing this, all the earth is going to be filled with my glory. Everybody's going to know that I can do what I said I'm going to do, that I do pardon, and that I can bring this to happen. And he says, but here's the consequence. All the men which have seen my glory, the miracles, all these people that I've showed all this stuff, all the people that saw what happened in Egypt, and they still wouldn't listen to me. They still said I wasn't a big enough God to follow through with what I promised. They're not even going to see the land, which I talked to them. Now remember, most of these people haven't yet seen the land. You got 12 spies that did, so those guys have seen the land. The rest of them have heard about it, and God says they're not even going to get to look at it. And of the original million people or so that were above the age, I think, of 21, if I remember right. I could be wrong there, but there was a certain age, God said, which were the adults. He said they're not going to see the land. Of that original group of 1 million people, there were only 13 people that actually got to see the land. There were the 12 spies, and Moses got to stand on top of a mountain before his death and look over and see it. And at this point, Moses hasn't even seen the land. And Moses never gets to enter into it, but God allowed him to at least look at it. So you got 1 million people in 40 years, and 13 of them get to actually see the land God talked about. All right, and so God says the consequences is for the next 40 years, you're going to be wandering around in the wilderness. Now, he didn't punish their sins. He didn't send them all to hell. He didn't strike them all dead on the spot. But he says there is a consequence. So since God had pardoned them, they still have to suffer a consequence, which is none of the actual people of adulthood get to enter the land. God could have killed them all on the spot. He's already mentioned about doing that and then starting over another nation. He could have even sent them back and let the Egyptians recapture them and put them all back in slavery for another 40 years and let them restart again. But he didn't do that. All he did was withhold something that he had previously promised as a blessing. He told them, I'm going to take you to a brand new land. He did bring them out of Egypt, and they're no longer in slavery. And over the next 40 years, he continues to feed them. He continues to bless them. It talks about that their clothes never wear out. Their shoes apparently grew as their feet grew because their shoes never wear out. So somehow God provides everything they absolutely have to have, even down to the shoes aren't expiring or needing new shoes. And so God continues to bless the people, but they just don't get the ultimate blessing as a consequence of their sin of basically rejection of God's promises. I would assume that most of these people would have, in day one, been happy to jump at a chance to be nomads in the wilderness than to be beaten half to death as a slave every day. So they're still way ahead of where they would have been. So God hasn't punished them for this because he said he would pardon them. He just simply said, you're not going to get everything that I had for you because you won't accept it. And which has some similarities to what he offers us as salvation. Here's the offering. Either you take it or you don't. These people were offered the land of Canaan, and they said, no, thank you. And God, likewise in his character, he never forces us to take a blessing that he offers us. He continues to give us free will to do that. Okay, does that get us up to 24?
Roger, let me ask a question.
Yes.
Do you think it was all of the people, men, women, and all that died? It just mentioned men. I guess I always had in my mind it was just the men over 21. You think it was women and men all?
I have always been under the understanding and the assumption that everybody from that age upward wandered around and died.
Why 21? I would thought it was closer to 12.
I always heard 20 or 21.
Well, the reason I'm saying 12 is when 12 the age when the boys were considered a man.
Yes, it was.
And
Take
21
a moment
is
to look that up.
awful old.
Ask the phone. I think the Bible tells us specifically somewhere, and I'm going to ask her to look that up.
Verse 28.
Was it verse 28? Okay. Where are we at here?
29, I'm sorry.
Okay, it says, verse 14:29. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, and that wasn't just men, it says all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me.
Oh, okay.
So if you're 20 years old or older,
Forget it.
you're not going to make it. Which I find very odd and interesting because if you think about this, people at that point were living better than 100 years old, as describes Moses lived to 120. So a guy that was 21, at the time they left Egypt, he died before he got to 41, or 61, excuse me.
Yeah.
So 40 years later, he was dead, which would have been a very young death compared to some of the people and what they were living. And I think it talks about Joshua and Caleb were 80 or 90 maybe when they went into the land. So they were older men when they were spies. And they talk about them, and I've always been amazed that 80 and 90-year-old guys were fighting giants, because I think it was Caleb asked for a specific mountain that was covered with giants. And he's in his 80s and he decided to take on all the giants. I assume he had his kids or whatever to help him, but it was just an odd thing when you think about people of that age deciding they're gonna go out.
Are you saying that George Lee couldn't do that?
Well, I would say he's probably not inclined to do that. Wouldn't ask for it. So, and Caleb specifically asked if he could do that. I've always found that interesting.
They lived a much better lifestyle.
Right.
So far as food and nourishment, you know, and all that good stuff, and exercise,
Well,
than we ever thought about.
Well, in this particular case, they lived on perfect food because God was providing manna. And elsewhere, I think it was in the New Testament I saw, that manna was described as angel's food. So that was interesting to me that the angels were eating manna prior to the Jewish people eating manna. So that was interesting. I think, does that run through where we are in the lesson today?
Yes.
Okay. I had a couple other things that I thought I would mention, and if somebody would read verses 24 and 25 in 14, or if nobody has that, I can read it.
But my servant Caleb, because he had another spirit with him, and had thought before him will I bring into the land whereinto he went, and his seed shall possess it. Now the Amorites and the Canaanites dwelt in the valley. Tomorrow turn ye and get ye into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea.
Okay,
Now,
that's fine. All right, this is kind of the follow-up to it. I went and looked ahead, and they don't really follow up a whole lot in next week's lesson about what happened here. God says in verse 24, Caleb, and later he mentions Joshua as well. He says, because they have a different spirit and followed me, I'm going to bring them into the land. So the two spies that brought back the good report, God says, even though I'm withholding this blessing from 1 million people, those two guys trusted me, they still get the blessing. And so, don't know, but I'm assuming then the fact that God singled out these two guys, there must have been of the 1 million people, practically no one or literally no one else who went along with Joshua and Caleb and were willing to trust God. So, because God wiped them all out except two guys that get to go in. And this just goes to show it's God blesses the servants, and then he tells them that he wants them to turn and go back away by the way of the Red Sea, because the valley right before them has these, it's actually, if I remember right, the eastern part of Canaan, and the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there, and he wants to avoid them having to cross paths with them. Yes?
is verse 12, does that mean that the 10 men that went in with Caleb and Joshua, God killed them right there?
No. You're talking about verse 14, 12.
12.
Okay, that's when God was threatening to wipe out the entire nation completely, and he repented from that based on Moses' intervention. God here was saying, I'm going to take care and just kill all 2 million of them and start fresh, and Moses requested that God not do that and bring glory to himself. The area where they entered, I was reading about, is a very rocky terrain, and later on they entered there, and I found that to be interesting because as they were entering the land to fight with the people of the land, the Canaanites and Jebusites and Hittites and all those good guys, or bad guys as they were, that would have given them cover. And if they had entered here, God had already had a plan for how they were going to get into the land. Because, you know, if you got 1 million people out here that's covering a 30 or 40 mile area, that's not ideal to take people on one-on-one on flat ground. So, and especially the Israelites coming in, they're not a trained army. They're a bunch of farmers and, well, not so much farmers, more shepherds, and they're gonna have the implements of shepherding and whatnot, and so they're attacking this. I'm sure that some of the stuff they took out of Egypt, when they received all of the plunder as God describes it out of Egypt, that there were some weapons among them, but they certainly didn't have the outfitting for a 500,000 man army.
They didn't know how to do it anyway.
Right, exactly, so that's not their background, so God already had the plan, they just refused to implement it. And just to follow up, the next morning, after hearing what God has to say, they all decide that they're gonna go in anyway. They said, oh, I don't wanna wander in the wilderness for 40 years, well, let's gather up and go in. And repenting of your attitude after God has dealt out the consequence of it doesn't remove the consequence. And as a matter of fact, at this point now, they're not doing what God told them to do. He told them to turn around and leave. And so they decide, after refusing to do what God told them to do, God tells them to do something else, and so now they're going to go do what God told them to do in the first place. That never works. I mean, it's just like, and most of us have had children, your children, don't try to do it after you refuse to do it to make everything okay. That doesn't work. And that's what happened here. And that's in verse 40. And that's really a false repentance. They weren't really repentant. They're just trying to avoid the punishment or the consequence. I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to go do this. And it goes on to say that they were defeated when they tried to enter. And what I took from this is there's a window of time for repentance that God gives you. And that even extends to our salvation. Once you're dead, the time's gone. You know, we have the life that God gave us, and He describes it as a vapor, and you have a certain window of time in which to come to Christ, and if you don't, then you suffer the consequences. And what happened here is, in verse 42, it says that Moses tells them, go not up, for the Lord is not with you, and you're going to be smitten before your enemies. So Moses tells them, hey, this is a really bad idea. God's not with you, and everything you thought about the giants is getting ready to happen because God's not there to back you up. And he said, the Amalekites are there, the Canaanites are there, you're going to fall by the sword because you turned away from the Lord and He's not with you. And this is a reminder, you can't do God's work without God's backing. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter whether you're ministering in the children's church, if you're ministering in Bread of Life, our ESL ministry. If God's not with you, you're wasting your time. So, choir, whatever, it doesn't matter. If God's not with you, you're wasting your time. And it says that they presumed to go up into the hilltop in verse 44, and nevertheless, the Ark of the Covenant, the Lord and Moses departed not out of the camp. I mean, it's symbolic, but the Levites, Moses, Ark, if you guys are going to do that, God's already told us not to. Everything's staying here. It says, the Amalekites came down, and the Canaanites which dwelt in that land, and they smote them, and they discomfited them even to Hormah. So basically, they just ran them off the face of the earth and chased them out. And you can't do it on your own. You can't do it after God tells you not to. You do it when God asks, or you don't. And that was the consequence of them. And it looks like I'm way early.